It is March, and the floor of the New York Stock Exchange is about to come apart. A grocer from Memphis has done something no grocer is supposed to be able to do. He has bought up almost every share of his own company. The men who bet against him are trapped. They sold stock they did not own, certain the price would fall, and now they have to buy it back from the one man who holds all of it. He can name his price. By noon, the stock has nearly doubled. On paper, the grocer is about to make tens of millions of dollars. His name is Clarence Saunders. You have walked past his idea 10,000 times without knowing it. Before he ever set foot near Wall Street, this man changed something so ordinary that we forgot it was ever invented. He is the reason you push a cart. He is the reason you pick your own groceries off a shelf instead of handing a list to a clerk behind a counter. That store he built had a name that meant nothing on purpose, and it spread across the country like a rumor. Then he tried to break Wall Street, and for one afternoon, it looked like he had. This is the story of how a man with 2 years of schooling invented the supermarket. He raised a palace out of pink marble, then he lost all of it, and did the whole thing over again. It sounds invented. Most of it is not. So we begin at a small store on Jefferson Street with the strangest businessman the grocery trade ever produced. Piggly Wiggly. Everyone who knew the grocery business agreed on one thing: the store would fail. It opened on September 6, 1916, at 79 Jefferson Street in Memphis. From the sidewalk, it looked wrong. There was a turnstile at the door, the kind you would expect at a fairground, not a food shop. Inside, there were no clerks waiting to help you. There was no long counter to stand at. There were just shelves, packed close together, and a narrow path that wound through all of them. To understand why this looked like madness, you have to know how people bought food in 1916. You walked into a store and you waited. You handed a clerk your list, and he walked the shelves for you, fetching each item while you stood there. If 4 people were ahead of you, you waited for all 4. Most stores ran on credit and delivery, which sounds pleasant until you remember that someone pays for credit and delivery, and that someone was always the customer. Saunders looked at all of that and saw waste. The waiting was waste. The clerks were waste. The whole slow ceremony of it struck him as money set on fire. So he turned the store inside out, pulling the goods off the back shelves and setting them where a customer could reach them. Each shopper got a basket and a nudge toward the turnstile. Past that gate, you were on your own. You walked the path and picked what you wanted. You carried it to the front yourself. Every item wore a price tag, which was its own small revolution, because in most stores the price lived in the clerk's head and shifted depending on who was asking. The path mattered more than it looked. Saunders did not let you wander. He built a single winding aisle that ran past every shelf in the store so that to reach the exit you had to pass all of it. You came in for flour and walked out with flour and soap and a tin of something you had not planned to buy. The impulse buy was born right there, though he never used the term. The logic was simple to him. A person who sees a thing is far likelier to want it. The first store held a little over 1,100 square feet. It was small and odd, and it worked almost at once. Prices ran lower because Saunders had stripped out the cost of all those clerks and all that credit. Shoppers noticed. They came back. Within a year, he had filed for a patent on the whole idea, the self-service store, granted in 1917, and from then on he guarded it like treasure. And then there was the name. He called it Piggly Wiggly. Not a family name, not a place, not anything that meant a thing. For the rest of his life, people asked him why, and he enjoyed the question far too much to answer it straight. One story says he watched some piglets struggle under a fence from a train window, and the rhyme stuck. Another says he made it up cold, precisely because it was the kind of name a person could not forget. When a reporter pressed him once, he said he picked it so that people would ask him that very question. I think that was the truest answer he ever gave about anything. The name tells you who he was. A cautious man would have called it Saunders' Grocery. Clarence Saunders called it Piggly Wiggly, painted it across a building, and dared you to laugh and then dared you to forget it. The joke was the marketing. The strangeness was the point. By the time the doors had been open a year, the laughter had stopped. The little store on Jefferson Street was earning faster than anyone had predicted. Saunders was no longer a Memphis grocer with an odd idea. What he did next would turn one strange shop into 1,000. The unlikely inventor. In the autumn of 1903, a grocery clerk with no money and no standing married the daughter of a wealthy Illinois lawyer. Her name was Carolyn Walker. His name was Clarence Saunders, and almost nothing about him explained why she said yes. He had come from about as far down as an American could start. Saunders was born in 1881 on a farm in Amherst County, Virginia, into a family the Civil War had emptied out. His father had marched with the Confederate Army and come home to ruin, the way so many Southern men did. Clarence was 5 years old when his mother died. Whatever softness a childhood is supposed to hold, his held very little of it. In 1891, the family gave up on Virginia and moved to Tennessee, where his father worked another man's land as a sharecropper near a town called Palmyra. The boy worked it too. By 11, he was spending his summers in a sawmill and a limestone kiln, and his holidays behind the counter of a general store. 2 years of schooling was the whole of his education. At 14, he quit for good and went to work full-time. Plenty of poor boys worked hard in 1895. What set this one apart was what he did with the little time that was his own. He read. He read constantly, anything he could reach, teaching himself the things the schoolhouse never got around to. I have come across a fair number of these rise stories, and the self-taught ones make me a little uneasy, because a man who answers to no teacher often ends up answering to no one at all. He moved through a string of jobs across the region: shop assistant, night watchman, sawmill hand. None of it stuck because none of it was the point. The point was up. At 19, he landed in Clarksville, Tennessee, in the wholesale grocery trade, working for two men named Hurst and Boylan, and there he climbed fast enough that people started to watch him. That is where Carolyn found him. They came from opposite ends of the American ladder, and they married anyway. A year after the wedding, the couple moved to the city that would make him. Memphis in those years was loud with money. It sat on the river and on the railroads, a funnel that the cotton and the goods of half the South had to pass through. The population had jumped from 33,000 in 1880 to more than 100,000 by the time the Saunders family arrived, and the men who got rich there were often not the planters or the bankers. They were the wholesalers, the ones who bought cheap in bulk and sold the region what it could not do without. Saunders walked straight into that trade and gave it the devotion other men saved for Scripture. He worked for one wholesale grocer, then another, watching how stores ordered and where they quietly bled money. An idea began to take shape that had nothing to do with wholesaling at all. In 1913, he pulled a group of retail grocers together into a venture he called United Stores. It was his first try at bending the trade to his own design. A step toward something, though even he may not have known toward what. By then, he was past 30, a self-made man in a hurry, with a wife from a finer family than his own, and a head full of plans the grocery business had never asked for. He had spent his whole life watching other people sell food badly. Now he was almost ready to show them how it should be done. You already know what he did with that idea. The question the rest of this story asks is what it cost him. The empire. 5 years after that first odd little store opened, there were 615 of them. 615 Piggly Wiggly stores, scattered across 200 cities in 40 states, all of them running the same way, all of them printing money. A year later, the number passed 1,000. Saunders had built one of the fastest-growing retail chains the country had yet seen, and he had done it on a piece of arithmetic that most grocers could not follow even after he showed them. The arithmetic was franchising. Saunders did not have to build every store himself, and he was far too impatient to try. Instead, he sold the right to use his system. A grocer in Dallas or Denver paid Saunders a fee and ran a store built to his exact design. The sign out front said, "Piggly Wiggly." A share of the profits came home to Memphis, where more than 250 people worked at headquarters just to keep the machine fed. His idea multiplied while his own risk stayed put. By the early 20s, his stores reached from Texas to the Carolinas, and the cash was rolling in faster than he could spend it. Imitators came fast, which is the surest sign a thing is working. Up sprang Handy Andy, then Helpy Selfie, then Mick or Mac, and a Mississippi chain with the unimprovable name of Jitney Jungle. Each one borrowed the basic notion of letting people shop for themselves, and each one wrapped it in its own patented machinery to keep Saunders' lawyers at a distance. The whole grocery trade had watched him laugh his way to riches, and now it wanted in. He did not seem to mind. A man does not get jealous of his own reflection. The copies could not catch him anyway, because Saunders was not selling shelves and gates. He was selling a method, refined and patented and stamped with a name the public already trusted. By 1922, his company was large enough and profitable enough that he did the thing every ambitious American businessman of his age eventually did. He took it to Wall Street. In February of 1922, Piggly Wiggly Stores was listed on the New York Stock Exchange. This was the respectable summit. A barefoot Virginia farm boy now had his shares trading beside the railroads and the steel mills quoted every day in the financial pages. The stock moved well. Tens of thousands of new shares went out at more than $40 each, and the dividend ran fat enough, near 11%, to make the stock look like a favor to anyone who bought it. For a while, everything Saunders touched seemed to prove that he was right, and everyone else was slow. He was, by any honest measure, among the largest grocers in the United States. He was rich in a way his father could never have pictured. Fame had found him too, and he was barely past 40. And here I should say, the thing that every story like this is quietly building toward. Success on that scale does something to a certain kind of man. It does not make him careful. It persuades him that the rules other people obey are just obstacles he has not gotten around to beating. Saunders had spent his whole life proving doubters wrong. He had lost the ability to imagine that the doubters might, even once, be right. That blindness was about to meet the one arena built to punish it. Down in New York, inside the very exchange that had just crowned him, a few men were starting to look at Piggly Wiggly stock and see something other than a triumph. They saw a target. The showman. A grocer once picked the governor of Tennessee. That is not a figure of speech. The year was 1922. The candidate was Austin P., an old acquaintance from Saunders' hometown of Clarksville, and Saunders threw behind him the one thing he owned in abundance. Not money, though there was money too. Ink. He bought up newspaper space and filled it with the bold, plain-talking persuasion he had spent years perfecting on flour and soap. When the votes were counted, P had won, and the new governor handed the grocer open credit for the victory. By some accounts, Saunders was among the first men in Tennessee to run a candidate the way you would run a product. Let me pause the clock here, because the ledgers and the store counts do not actually explain Clarence Saunders. This does. He had grasped something the bankers and the experts of his day were slow to see. An ordinary person reading the morning paper over coffee could be reached directly, and whoever reached them first usually won the argument. So Saunders never lobbied. He did not work quiet rooms or court the powerful, but went straight over their heads to the public in big black type with a showman's appetite for the spotlight. You could see it in everything he touched. The man enjoyed being looked at. He liked the noise his own success made, and where a more cautious businessman would have stayed modest, he turned the volume up. Attention was not a side effect of his business. Attention was the business. A store nobody talked about was a store already dying, and he meant for no store of his to ever go quiet. Underneath the showmanship sat a conviction that shaped every choice he made. Saunders trusted the crowd more than he trusted the rule makers. He had watched that crowd make him rich, watched them flock to his strange little stores. And he had drawn a lesson from it that was mostly true and a little dangerous. The lesson was this: if you can reach enough ordinary people, loudly and before anyone else, you can win almost any fight. It was mostly true. Almost any fight is not every fight. There is one kind of opponent a newspaper cannot touch. Some powers never step into the daylight where an advertisement can find them. They sit behind closed doors, in committee rooms, among men who have known one another for 30 years, and settle things long before the public hears a word. Against that, a full-page ad is a man shouting at a building. Saunders did not believe such a power could exist, or that it could stand against him if it did. He had spent a decade proving that the loudest, plainest voice in the room walks away with the prize. Soon he would carry that faith straight into a room built by the very men who knew it was a lie. And the strange part, the one I cannot get past, is that he was almost right. When he finally turned his newspapers on Wall Street, the public did rally to him. Ordinary Americans cheered the grocer who was going to teach the slick men of New York a lesson. For a few wild weeks it looked like ink alone might be enough. It was not. But to see why, you first have to look at the house he was raising while he sharpened his knives. Because Clarence Saunders did not only fight in newsprint, he also built in marble. The Pink Palace. The marble came from Georgia, and it was pink. Not a quiet pink, either. It was the kind of pink that stops a person on the sidewalk and makes him forget where he was going. Saunders began building the house in 1922 on a wide piece of ground in Memphis, at the very top of everything. By then, he was rich and famous, and he had decided that the world should be able to see both from the street, so he ordered tons of pink Georgia marble and hired an architect named Hubert McGee to wrap a house around it. Mansion is almost too small a word. The finished plans called for more than 36,000 square feet, 2 stories of rambling stone under a green tile roof, with arches and bay windows everywhere you looked. McGee, who actually drew the thing, struggled to name the style. He settled on the phrase Romanesque American Rambling, which means, roughly, that it was whatever Clarence Saunders wanted it to be. And Saunders wanted a great deal. The plan set aside ground for a private lake and a golf course. Inside there would be a bowling alley and an indoor swimming pool. There was even to be a shooting range, the way another man might want a porch swing. This was not a house so much as a small kingdom with a roof, built for a family of 5 by a man who as a boy had owned nothing at all. He named it Claude Leclerc, stitched together from the names of his 3 children. The people of Memphis took one look at the rising pink stone and chose something simpler. They called it the Pink Palace, and that name, unlike the one Saunders picked, has lasted 100 years. There is a story he liked to tell about the design, and I believe it says more than the blueprints do. By his own telling, the architect had only written up the specifications, while he, Saunders, had laid out the shape of the whole place himself, in 2 days. He knew what he wanted. He had always known what he wanted. The trouble with a man like that is that he eventually stops asking whether what he wants is wise. By the time the marble was going up, the house had already swallowed more than $1 million, and it still was not finished. Put it in plainer terms, Saunders was spending on a single home what would have built a small town, and he was paying for it out of his own pocket, treating the deepest fortune of his life as though it could never run dry. It is worth standing here a moment, in 1922, and looking at the man. He has the stores. He has the stock trading in New York. The governor owes him a favor, the imitators chase his shadow, and the Pink Palace is climbing over Memphis like a sunrise that decided to stay. Everything he ever wanted is finally his, and he is certain, dead certain, that none of it can be taken away. Out in New York, in an office he had never set foot in, a small group of men were studying his company and reaching the opposite conclusion. They thought the grocer had climbed too high and too fast. They thought his stock was a bubble waiting to burst, and they were getting ready to make a great deal of money proving it. The palace would have to wait. Clarence Saunders was about to be called north to Wall Street, and he had no notion yet that the coming months would decide whether he kept any of it at all. Breaking Wall Street. The whole disaster started with a single failed store. In early 1923, a cluster of Piggly Wiggly outlets in New York went under. In the life of a company with more than 1,000 stores, this was a scratch, not a wound. But a few men on Wall Street looked at that scratch and saw a chance to draw blood. What they launched was a bear raid. The phrase needs explaining, because it sits at the center of everything that follows. To bet that a stock will fall, a trader can sell shares he does not actually own. He borrows them from someone who does and sells them at today's price, on the promise that he will hand the same shares back later. If the price drops the way he hopes, he buys them back cheaply and keeps the difference. The lower the stock sinks, the more he makes. These traders are called bears, and when a pack of them goes after one stock together, talking it down and selling hard, that is a bear raid. The firm of Merrill Lynch and a handful of other speculators decided Piggly Wiggly was ripe for it. They began shorting the stock and whispering that the grocery chain was overbuilt and overvalued, a southern fad on the edge of collapse. The price started to slide. And down in Memphis, Clarence Saunders read about it in the papers and lost his temper completely. He took it as a personal insult, which in his mind it was. These were not merely men betting against a stock. They were sneering at his company and his city, at the very idea that a barefoot Tennessee grocer belonged on the same exchange as theirs. He said Wall Street had come swooping down on Piggly Wiggly like an eagle on a chicken, and he decided, with the total confidence of a man who had never lost, that he would break Wall Street in return. A friend should have stepped in and grabbed his arm. I would have. The safe move, the sensible move, was to ignore the bears and let the business speak for itself. Saunders did the opposite. He went to a group of Southern bankers and borrowed $10 million, a staggering sum, worth well over $100 million in today's money. Then he marched into the open market and began buying his own company's stock by the fistful. His plan was simple and aggressive. If the bears were forcing the price down, he would force it back up by buying everything in sight. Within a week, he had scooped up more than 100,000 of the 200,000 shares in existence. The stock that had sagged toward $39 began to climb. 40, then 50, then 60, and still rising, while the bears who had sold high started to sweat. Saunders did not fight quietly. He never did anything quietly. The newspapers reported that he had arrived in New York on a private railroad car trailed by 4 armed guards carrying suitcases stuffed with $1 million in cash. One New York paper told its readers that Wall Street had better put locks on its safes because Clarence had come to town to teach the city how the financial game was really played. To half the country it was the best show in years. The little man had come to humble the giants. Out in the towns and the farms, people who had never owned a share of anything in their lives were rooting for the grocer who had walked straight into the lion's den. What almost none of them understood, and what Saunders himself did not yet grasp, was that he had not actually won anything. He had only set a trap. And the most dangerous thing about a trap is the moment you realize you are standing inside it too. The trap. On the morning of Tuesday, March 20th, 1923, Clarence Saunders demanded his shares back. That single demand was the whole trap, and it took most of Wall Street the rest of the day to understand that the jaws had already closed. Here is what the bears had failed to notice. While they were busy shorting Piggly Wiggly and betting it down, Saunders had been quietly buying it up. By that Tuesday, he claimed to hold all but about 1,100 of the 200,000 shares in existence. Nearly every piece of paper that proved you owned a sliver of Piggly Wiggly was sitting in his vault. This is called a corner, and it is the deadliest position in the old market. When one man controls the entire supply of a thing, anyone who needs that thing must come to him and pay whatever he asks. The bears needed Piggly Wiggly badly, and they did not yet know it. To place their short bets, they had borrowed shares and sold them off. Some of those borrowed shares had come, without their knowing the source, from Saunders himself. He had lent his own stock to the very men trying to ruin him, which sounds like madness until you see the point of it. A lender can call his shares back whenever he pleases. So on that Tuesday morning, Saunders called, and the bears, who had already sold those shares to strangers, now had to go and buy them back to return them. Buy them back from whom? That was the trap. Saunders owned nearly all of it. The bears fanned out across the exchange hunting for Piggly Wiggly stock, and there was almost none to be had because the one man who held it had no intention of selling. The handful of shares that did change hands climbed in price by the minute. The stock opened that morning around $75. Within the hour, the frantic bears had bid it up to 90, then 100, then 105. By midday, Piggly Wiggly touched $124 a share, with almost nothing actually trading, because the only real seller in the building was a grocer from Memphis who sat watching the numbers climb and saying very little. Do the arithmetic, and it is hard to fathom. Men who had sold the stock short at $40 now had to buy it back at $124 to settle their debts. Every dollar the price rose came out of their pockets and went toward his. In the space of a single morning, on paper, a Memphis grocer had turned the tables on the most powerful financiers in the country and stood to collect a fortune from them. Under the rules of the exchange, the bears had until the following afternoon to deliver the shares they owed. They could not find them. They were caught in his fist, exactly as he had planned, and they knew it. Word raced out of New York and across the country. The grocer had done it. The country boy who had barely seen the inside of a schoolhouse had walked into the Temple of American Finance and beaten its high priests at their own game. In Memphis, they were ready to throw him a parade. In the farm towns, they treated him like a folk hero. And I will give him this. For a few hours on the afternoon of March 20th, Clarence Saunders was the most envied businessman in America, and he believed with everything in him that the fight was over and he had won. He had not won. He had done something far more dangerous than win. In one morning he had embarrassed the New York Stock Exchange in front of the entire nation, and the men who ran that exchange were not about to let a grocer make fools of them. While Saunders sat counting his paper fortune, they were already gathering in a closed room. They were about to change the rules of the game while it was still being played. The rules change. Powerful institutions do not lose gracefully. When one is about to be beaten, it reaches for the rulebook, and if the rulebook will not save it, it writes a new one while no one is looking. That is what the New York Stock Exchange did to Clarence Saunders. On the very afternoon he believed he had won, the governing committee of the exchange, a body made up of the same kind of men he had just humiliated, retired to a closed room to decide his fate. They did not care for what a Memphis grocer had done to their friends, and they held the one power Saunders did not. They made the rules of the floor, and they could change them. They made two decisions, and the second one killed him. First, they suspended trading in Piggly Wiggly stock, which froze the price and stopped the squeeze in its tracks. Then came the blow. Under the normal rule, the cornered bears had 1 day to deliver the shares they owed. The committee gave them 5. 5 days instead of 1, handed to the very men who were drowning, for no reason that served anyone but them. To see why those 4 extra days mattered so much, you have to remember where the missing shares were. They were not all in New York. They were scattered in the hands of ordinary people across the country, folks who had bought a few shares of Piggly Wiggly years ago and forgotten about them. In a single day, the bears could never have found them. In 5 days they could. Telegrams went out to every corner of the map, and the shares came in. Out in towns like Sioux City, people who had never heard the words Piggly Crisis got a strange and welcome offer in the mail. Someone wanted to buy their old forgotten stock for around $100 a share, double what it had been worth. They sold, delighted, with no idea they were rescuing Wall Street and burying a grocer in Memphis. Share by share, from places Saunders could not reach, the bears covered their debts. Saunders saw it happening and fought to the last. He offered to settle for $150 a share if the bears delivered fast, and $250 if they dragged their feet, trying to keep the pressure on. It made no difference. The exchange had given them the only thing they needed, which was time, and time was now on their side. By the end of the week, most of the bears had paid him back in full. And here is the cruelest part of it. The bears paid him back in shares of Piggly Wiggly, not the high prices he had dreamed of collecting, but the stock itself, now frozen and very nearly worthless. Saunders had won his corner in the narrowest technical sense. He had his shares. What he did not have was money. He sat in Memphis holding a mountain of paper that no one would buy at any price. Beneath it sat a $10 million debt, very real and very much due. His clever escape had failed too. Weeks earlier, sensing he would need a way out, Saunders had advertised shares for sale to the public at $55 apiece, a way to turn his paper into cash on his own terms. Once the exchange froze the stock and the price collapsed, no one wanted to buy a falling thing at $55. The door he had built for himself was bricked over. I will be honest. This is the part where my sympathy quietly changes sides. People still argue about whether the exchange had the right to do what it did. Halting the trading was within its power. Extending the deadline for the losing side, in the middle of the fight, was something else, and scholars debate it to this day. What is not in doubt is the result. Clarence Saunders had played the game better than the men who invented it, and they had simply reached over and moved the board. It was one of the last great corners the New York Stock Exchange would ever permit. Before long, new laws would make the whole maneuver illegal. He had spent his fortune and borrowed a second one to build the perfect trap. He had caught his enemies inside it, and then, in the space of a single committee meeting, the floor opened beneath his own feet. The man who set the trap was now standing in one of his own, and this time there was no clever demand he could make, no newspaper ad he could run that would let him climb out. Sole owner of my name. When it was over, Clarence Saunders had his name and very little else. By the end of that summer, the corner he had won was finished with him. The loan came due in September, $2.5 million of it, and the cash simply was not there. So in August of 1923, Saunders resigned as president of the company he had built from a single store, and he signed nearly everything he owned over to his creditors. His stock, his automobiles, and the Pink Palace, the marble house he had poured a fortune into. He gave it up, having never spent a single night under its roof. Some of his Piggly Wiggly shares, once the most fought-over stock in America, were auctioned off for $1. A year later, he was formally bankrupt. The papers that had sung his praises a month before now had a new name for him. They called him the Boob from Tennessee. He raged at the exchange and swore he would spend the rest of his life seeing justice done. The lawsuits he threatened went nowhere at all. Wall Street, having taken everything from him, simply moved on and forgot he existed. Most men do not come back from a fall like that. They find a quiet job or a bottle, and they tell the story of the time they almost beat Wall Street to anyone who will sit still for it. Clarence Saunders was not most men. Within a year he was opening grocery stores again, and the name he chose for them tells you he had learned nothing and forgotten nothing. He called the new chain Clarence Saunders, sole owner of my name. By one telling, the name came from a bankruptcy judge who looked at him across the courtroom and said that he owned nothing now but his own name. Saunders heard that as a dare. The new owners of Piggly Wiggly had taken his company and his patents, and they half believed they had bought his name along with them. So he printed that name on every store he built, in letters a foot high, just to prove it still belonged to him. He set his sole owner stores up wherever he could, often directly across the street from a Piggly Wiggly, daring his old company to compete with the man who had invented their whole way of doing business. And it worked. The stores caught on, the money came back, and within a few years he was a millionaire all over again. He even built himself a second estate outside Memphis, a sprawling lodge of log and timber, because a man who has lost one palace apparently needs to prove he can raise another. Then there is the football team, which I promise is real. To promote his stores, Saunders bankrolled a professional squad and called them the Sole Owner Tigers. In December of 1929, his grocery store team played the Green Bay Packers, the reigning champions of the National Football League, and beat them 20-6. The league was impressed enough to invite the Tigers to join. He said no. The story goes that he simply did not care for the idea of traveling to other cities for away games. By the close of the 1920s, he had done the impossible. He had lost one fortune and built another, lost one mansion, and raised a second. Memphis learned the lesson all over again. You could take Clarence Saunders down, but you could not keep him there. He was on top once more, louder and prouder than ever, and he had no way of knowing that the worst economic storm in the country's history was now only months away. The machine that never worked. The second time Clarence Saunders lost everything, there was no villain to rage at. The sole owner stores had made him rich and proud all over again. Then, in October of 1929, the stock market crashed, and the long misery of the Great Depression settled over the country. People stopped spending. Stores everywhere went dark, and the chain Saunders had built so quickly came apart just as fast, sliding into bankruptcy in the early 1930s. There was no governing committee this time, no closed room to blame, just the slow, grinding failure of a whole economy, which is a far lonelier thing to lose to than Wall Street. A reasonable man, twice ruined, might finally have rested. Saunders did the opposite. He went looking for backers, found a few who still believed in him, and poured what was left of his energy into the strangest idea of his whole strange life. The plan was to build a grocery store that ran almost entirely without people. He called it the Key-Doozle, another made-up word, the way Piggly Wiggly had been. The first one opened in Memphis in 1937, and it worked like something out of a dream of the future. The groceries sat behind glass, each item with a small keyhole beneath it. You walked the aisles with a special key, and when you saw what you wanted, you put the key in the slot. The machine noted your choice on a paper tape. At the front, the system read the tape, and your groceries came gliding out to you on a conveyor belt, bagged and ready. It was, in a real sense, the supermarket of the future, dreamed up decades too early. And that was the problem. The machinery was complicated and expensive, and it tended to break down at exactly the wrong moment, when the store was full and every key was turning at once. Shoppers grew impatient. The marvel became a nuisance. Saunders tried again with an improved version after the war, and that one failed too, closing its doors in 1949. In between, during the war years, the man who had twice been a millionaire kept himself busy making toy wagons and broomsticks. Sit with that picture for a moment. The inventor of the modern supermarket, the grocer who had once frightened Wall Street, building little wooden toys in his 60s while he waited for the world to be ready for his machines. He never stopped. At the very end of his life, Saunders was working on yet another automated store, this one called the Food Electric. It was even more ambitious than the last, built around a primitive sort of computer he called a shopping brain. The device would let a customer ring up and wrap her own purchases without a single clerk. He meant to build it 2 blocks from the spot where the first Piggly Wiggly had opened, almost 40 years before. It never got built. Clarence Saunders died of heart failure in the autumn of 1953, still drawing up plans for a store that did not exist. It would be easy to call those last years sad, the broke old man and his broken machines. But I am not sure he saw it that way. Saunders had spent his entire life trying to take the friction out of buying a loaf of bread. He invented self-service, then spent 30 years trying to invent his way past even that, toward a store with no clerks and no human hands at all. The same idea chased him to his final breath. Most men never find one idea worth a whole life. He found his, and it carried him through 2 fortunes and 2 mansions, and it never once let go of him. Walk into any grocery store tonight, anywhere in the country, and you are standing inside Clarence Saunders' head. The cart in your hands, the open shelves, the price on every can, the slow loop the aisles pull you through, past 100 things you did not come for. He thought all of that up in a single small room in Memphis, and the world simply kept it, long after it forgot the man who handed it over. Piggly Wiggly is still out there too. More than 100 years on, hundreds of its stores still trade across the American South, each one independently owned, the silly name holding up just fine. Saunders would have enjoyed that. The name still makes people ask, which was always the whole point. And the Pink Palace still stands in Memphis. The marble house he poured a fortune into and never slept in became the city's first museum, back in 1930. and it has been full of visitors ever since. There is one exhibit I find hard to shake. Inside the palace that ruined him sits a careful replica of that first tiny Piggly Wiggly, the little store that started everything. The mansion and the shop, the peak and the beginning, both preserved under the same pink roof. His Wall Street fight had a strange second life as well. In 2021, when a crowd of small investors online squeezed the big hedge funds on a stock called GameStop, the financial pages went looking for a precedent. They found a Memphis grocer who had tried the very same thing in 1923 and nearly pulled it off before the people who owned the game changed it on him. 100 years later, his fight was suddenly everywhere again. That is the shape of Clarence Saunders. He won 2 fortunes and lost both. The 2 mansions he raised still stand, though he lost the first before he could ever move in. The football team he bankrolled really did beat the champions of the professional league, and the future he reached for would not arrive for another 70 years. He grasped at almost everything, and got to keep almost none of it. And yet the next time you push a cart down an aisle, lost in the small ordinary business of feeding your family, remember that a barefoot Virginia farm boy built the road you are walking. That may be the strangest fortune of all, the one he never knew he kept.